Recently, delegates to an International Red Cross meeting devoted time to the vexed question of whether video gamers might be violating the Hague and Geneva Conventions. And on the face of it, this is one of these oh come off it stories. I mean, surely they ought to be worrying about the rights of real people, not of electronic fictional things. But at the same time as one is tempted to dismiss this story, one is reminded of the question, are these games too violent for the good of the people playing them, if not of the fictional things that are the victims of some of this violence? So I'm joined now by Professor Nick Graham. He's a professor of computer science at Queen's University who teaches a course on the subject of these kind of games. And are people right to be worried about the effect on the gamers of this much violence, even though it is imaginary?
Well, it's an interesting question because ultimately people, it seems absolutely obvious that playing a lot of games involving killing of other people, sometimes in very brutal manners, has to have an effect. It has to lead to further violence. The ironic thing is that despite a lot of study in this area, often by people who have a real agenda and what they want to find out, there really is very little evidence that it does have a very strong negative effect.
And the games certainly, I think, are getting more realistic. One of the advantages or disadvantages of our growing computer power is that we're no longer playing chopper lifter. This stuff is as real as a movie, if not real life. Perhaps for some people it's more real than their life. Any sign that that's an issue?
Well, I'd like to go back even to 1997. I'll give you an example. A game came out in that year called GoldenEye. And GoldenEye was one of the very first games which had very realistic human figures. And where as a player, your goal was to play James Bond, and often that involved gunning these people down. And the violence, really, if you look at it in the context of sitting and looking at a TV program like this one, the violence was really quite nasty. For example, if you hit someone and wounded them, they might try crawling off, and as they're attempting to escape, you could just gun them down in the back and finish them off. So if you look at that kind of violence, that's been around in a very realistic context for 15 years now. And this is the interesting thing, that now if we look at it, if it really were the case that video game violence in a realistic sense was going to turn us all into homicidal maniacs, over these 15 years, we'd have begun to see it showing up. And in fact, over the same 15 years, crime rates among youth in particular have actually gone down.
Yeah, and I also think if you look at movies from the 1940s versus the way movies were done from the 1960s on, it's clear that in that kind of popular entertainment, more realistic violence has been with us for 2 generations now. So again, if this stuff were somehow poisoning the imagination, and I suppose people would have argued, well, in the 60s and 70s there was an increase in crime, but you know, graphic violence as part of what we passes for fun is not itself that new.
Right, exactly. And I think what we've been finding is that kids, for the most part, are really good at distinguishing between realistic and unrealistic situations, even if they're presented using realistic graphics. So, for example, in the game Grand Theft Auto, which has had a lot of negative press over the years because of the ultra-violent things that you can do, blowing up cars, shooting people down in the streets, kids who are playing with it understand that this is really something that's absolutely absurd. And they actually will laugh while they're playing over the absurdity of what they're doing. In a lot of ways, this could be compared, I think, to probably cartoons that you and I would have watched as kids, like the Roadrunner cartoons. We certainly didn't come away from that thinking it was a good idea to push people off cliffs and drop anvils on their heads.
No, not even coyotes. In fact, we got more sensitive to animal rights in this time. But you know, one thing though that does worry me to some extent about this, that at least in those cartoons, it was the coyote who was always trying to kill the Roadrunner, who was always the victim of violence. And I once saw an interview with Chuck Norris where he said that he didn't think his movies were violent because they had a moral structure. And so he was taking a kind of non-materialist argument that it's not so much what happens on the screen, here's a person having this happen, but whether what's happening is happening to bad guys or good guys. And I've never played Grand Theft Auto, but my concern with that game, I gather that you're meant to be stealing cars. And I can't help thinking that's different than playing a game where you're meant to be defeating the Nazis.
Absolutely, and so this would certainly be something you would want to look at, and people indeed have looked at. And in Grand Theft Auto, stealing cars is really only the beginning of it. But we do see is, again, it's this idea of being able to distinguish fantasy from reality. And all the evidence is that kids are pretty good at doing this. Where you can begin to run into troubles is where the games veer into what would be very close to real life experiences that the kids or even adult players would be experiencing on a regular basis. So where I would be more worried in a game would be, let's make up a fictional NHL-style hockey game where one of the things you can do in the game is smack another player on the head and give him a concussion and then be rewarded in the game for having increased the likelihood of your team winning. Yeah, that is something that is so close to what kids experience in their real lives and is therefore a realistic situation. And that's something where you would not want them to be training over and over again in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I'd much rather see them training in a hockey game where the goal was to put that round black thing in that metal doodad with the mesh. You know, it seems to me that would be a better thing to practice. And I think that the other thing that I find, why I don't find these games quite as troubling, is that surely the most violent thing in a violent person's life has always been their imagination. That normal people dream about rescuing people from bad guys, and abnormal people dream about victimizing them. And you can get violence inside your own head that's far more realistic than anything you can get even on a modern computer screen.
Yeah, I think where people worry is, and I think you were hinting about this before, is the repetition over and over again of particular activities once situations arise, and the worry that that will then trigger the same reaction in real life. And again, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence that's happening. Having said that, it's not all a rosy picture. So, for example, one very large study that was done by Kuttner and Olson in the early 2000s interviewed thousands of middle school kids, so 13-year-old kids. And they found that certainly almost all of these kids, certainly almost all of the boys, were playing mature rated games, so very violent games rated for 17 plus, despite the fact that they were 13. And the good news with that is that it largely had no apparent negative effect. It didn't seem to affect their value structures. It didn't affect their performance in school. It didn't affect the violence in their lives. Having said that, the group of kids who played these games the most, so were playing ultra-violent games for hours on a daily basis, were kids who were having significant problems. So, for example, involvement in bullying, involvement in vandalism, possibly involvement with the police. So,
in that sense, a habit of playing violent games might be a warning sign, not a cause, but a symptom of problems. And that is certainly something I would think that parents, friends, and teachers and everybody ought to watch out for. Professor Nick Graham, computer science at Queen's University, thanks for being with us to dispel some of the fears about computer games, but perhaps not all of them. And I'm just going to wrap up by saying I used to play chess, and if you took it literally, we were not only killing monarchs, but we were disposing of high church officials and also horses and elephants, which isn't a very nice thing to do either. I don't think we got any more violent. I'm not sure we polished our social skills either.